how do you want to get this episode started?
I don't know. Do you want to start with telling the world what you thought of the Leak Sandwich 250s?
Not really.
You don't?
No. I think people will probably just turn right off if I do that. So you know what I'm going to do?
What are you going to do?
We're going to start with a response to one of our viewer questions from the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. COMEAU. That's right, Peter. Peter's in the house. I mean, he's not physically in the house.
But he stopped by.
But he stopped by, in a way, in the comments.
In the comments.
Anyway, this was at Fuzz SBL's question.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Andrew, great episode. My only question, I was surprised to see the non-recessed mounting screws, which themselves appear recessed into the baffle. I'm guessing that was a style choice in the design, but I am curious about those raised edges right at the speaker surround. Would be something that would affect the sound, i.e. diffraction.
Oh, okay.
Well, Mr. Fuzz, Peter wrote back and says, that's an interesting comment.
It's a strong start, Peter.
In fact, very small projections, especially tiny cylindrical ones, as in the fixing screws, in close relationship to cones and domes, has an immeasurable effect, and we cannot detect them subjectively either. That doesn't really make sense.
No, it totally makes sense.
It does make sense?
No, that totally makes sense.
Okay, you
Totally.
can explain it to me in a minute. However, a large physical step all the way around, say a dome, will affect the diffraction and causes interference effects, which can easily be measured and heard. This is why drive units are recessed flush into baffles.
Okay.
You want to translate that for me, Robinson?
Well, about the mounting screws and hardware and stuff, there are some things that you might be able to point to on a graph, or in this case, physically on a speaker, and go, I bet that makes it suck. When in reality, people that have been doing this for a living for many, many years have realized that it's inaudible. It doesn't make a difference. However far out the screw pots or whatever project around the particular drivers has an immeasurable effect, and it's not even audible. So it's a non-issue that audiophiles are attempting to make an issue. As for everything else, yeah, I mean, how you mount a speaker's driver within the baffle is obviously going to have a huge role in how diffraction, dispersion, and all of those things play out. And those things are measurable. But we're talking about something in comparison. You're talking about a driver in its relation to the front baffle of a speaker versus a driver in its relation to maybe, you know, a minuscule little screw.
I happen to like the look of the speakers.
Yeah.
Exposed screws and all, you know. I didn't have a problem with that. They fit the style of the speaker. I think sometimes when you see elements like that, like a screw that's visible and not flush mounted or whatever, it's a sign of cost cutting. But
Maybe.
in this particular instance, because it's more of a sort of retro looking speaker, I think that it actually works. I really liked the silver accents and the wood veneer, and just overall it was a vibe.
It was. And if anyone wants to sit here and talk about comparisons and build quality, Google like original Leak Sandwich speakers. There's no comparison. Those speakers, I'm sure they were good. We have a lot of very passionate Leak owners in our comments, and I appreciate you 100%. But seeing old photos of like the 60s and 70s era speakers to today, screws be damned. They are just way better built today than they were back then.
Now, I'm going to move on to Nick Wilson's question.
Okay.
This is more of a general question. When you say neutral leaning, I'm not sure what that means. Isn't neutral? And then to use audiophile words, a speaker could lean towards cool or warm. If it's leaning towards neutral, what is your actual starting point? Warm?
All right. What is this person's name? I'm sorry.
Nick Wilson, 2318.
Nick, I apologize to you and everyone else that may have taken some friendly offense to the hyphen leaning. I really was just trying to say the speaker's neutral. It doesn't start warm or cool. It is a neutral speaker. I just thought it was a fun expression. It's a neutral speaker.
Okay, we're going to talk about the power requirements for the Leek Sandwich 250. At Rich Growl.
Okay.
Sorry if I jumbled that, Rich. So if I'm hearing this correctly, to get the true capabilities of this speaker, which is a roughly $3,000 speaker, I need decent amplification, which in your world is the Yamaha 2000A, a $4,000 integrated amp, or a McIntosh, which I didn't even bother looking up.
7,500.
The same is true for the Lintons and the Super Dintons, which are $1,800 and $1,400 speakers respectively. So if one has a sub $1,000 integrated amp, such as an Emotiva or a Cambridge, an Iota VX, etc., should one even bother thinking about any of these? And if not, what?
Look, I believe, and I believe I said this in our original Linton review, that the Linton, and now the Leek 250, and the Mission 770, if I'm not mistaken, all Peter designs. I believe in those reviews I alluded to, or I just outright said, that these are speakers that you can invest in today, and they will grow with you over time. These are speakers that, in my opinion, especially at the Leek 250 level, become heirloom quality. These are speakers you can have for life. They're built that way. They look good. They're going to hold up. And because of that, you can start with something like an Emotiva. A Bass XA2 will drive the Leek 250s just fine. But as your needs, maybe your budget, your desire to go further down the rabbit hole changes, know that you don't necessarily have to be side-eyeing your speaker going, are you the thing letting me down? Because in this instance, as we moved up market in amplification and associated equipment, the Leek hung in there. At no point did I feel like I was like, okay, I've reached the limits of what it's capable of. I just kept unlocking little minute changes in its performance as we moved up market. Now, some of you may be like, I'm not moving that far up market for a 2% difference. I get it. That's fine. So know that if you have an Emotiva Bass X or XPA 2, 3, whatever it is, you're going to be fine. You're going to enjoy a really, really good experience, same as you would with a Linton. But if down the road you're like, hey, I've got a chance to get my hands on like a Michi, a Rotel Michi, do you think that I need new speakers? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Get the Rotel, put it on this, and you're going to hear things that the speaker's always been capable of producing, but maybe your associated equipment wasn't always able to extract or control. And that's what I mean.
I would agree with that. I mean, I thought the RCAM sounded really good on the Leek, and that's not a crazy expensive. Isn't it $1,500?
Yeah, I think it's actually less now. I think it's somewhere between $1,300 and $1,500.
And I thought that was a good match.
Phenomenal.
I didn't think the Yamaha sounded bad.
Nope.
Certainly sounded good to me. I mean, honestly, it wasn't until the McIntosh showed up that we were like, oh.
Oh.
Oh, I mean, the McIntosh just kind of does that.
It does.
With just probably anything.
Yeah.
But it did, like Andrew is saying, it did elevate the overall experience and just you just could hear a little bit more of what I think the Leek is capable of.
Yeah.
So.
More easily.
Yeah, more easily.
Yeah.
And I think an Emotiva amp would probably do very well. I don't think I would put the Cambridge on it. I just don't think that's going to be... Unless you just like that sort of laid-back sound, but then I think you're going to diminish what's great about the Leek by pairing something like a Cambridge amp to that speaker. But that's just my personal take.
Yeah.
You do what you want. Let's go down a vintage path for a second here. At Jared Sidney James says, Given the vintage design and vibe, how do you think the leaks would pair with a vintage receiver like the Pioneer SX750 or something similar?
I think as long as your Pioneer has been serviced or has, been maintained properly. I mean, at that point, the Pioneer 7 Series, you're talking about a 40-year-old design. But as long as you've, done your due diligence and, maintained it, I think it would sound really good. The one thing about certain vintage receivers, especially ones that might be on the more budget side, even for back then, they weren't too dissimilar than receivers today, which is some of them don't like lower impedances. But I think at the 700 level from Pioneer, that wasn't a factor, that wasn't a problem. So I think you'll be fine. But like the 400 series, like our, 450 or 430 that we have, that's not recommended for something that's going to dip the way that maybe the Leak will, or just other speakers that are in the modern era. But 700 series, yeah, I think you're fine.
All right, let's talk about the toe-in.
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 That's our favorite new word. This question is from Dwayne.
Oh.
Dwayne Cleckley.
Okay.
Love Dwayne.
Yeah.
Question.
Okay.
In your review, you noted toe-in is important for these speakers. When it comes to speakers, what is the determining factor regarding how much toe-in is needed? Some speakers need more, some less. Is it just the speaker size, the listening position, the amount of drivers, the room?
Kind of all of the above, to be honest. Kind of all of the above, but it does vary speaker to speaker. If I'm ever not sure, a lot of manufacturers will suggest whether or not to toe their speakers in when you read the manual. There's a lot of information in the manuals, it turns out. So it does vary. It does vary speaker to speaker. And a lot of times too, for me, it varies based on just kind of personal experience. Like if I'm finding a speaker, I'm like, man, I'm just not getting a level of detail. Like everything is big and broad, but stuff is failing to kind of lock into place. If I'm sensing that, like singers or actors, if they're on a screen or, center imaging where they feel like they're, this wide when they need to be, this wide, that's when I'll start to experiment with toe-in. And by doing that, if I can orally hear them kind of become more life size and realistic in terms of their physical form, then I know I'm on the right track. But sometimes you can do that and the speaker just keeps it where it is, in which case it's something else entirely that's going on. But yeah, it really does vary speaker to speaker. There's no like hard and fast rule that I've learned of or that I've come across. Some speakers really love toe-in and some speakers absolutely not.
The next two questions are not ones that I'm surprised to see.
Okay.
A lot of people seem to have very specific feelings about whether or not you call something a bookshelf or a stand mount.
Oh, yeah.
Honestly, I don't care. But we're going to try to answer a couple viewer questions. At Improved Garage says, it seems to me there is a growing expectation from manufacturers that, quote, bookshelves are not going to be used on actual bookshelves and that they're going to be on stands several feet into the room. Mm-hmm. Did manufacturers change over time, or are we just better informed about this requirement now? How do you feel about this expectation and how it affects the appearance of a room? And then at Philip Ketchum says, why do you think manufacturers build, quote, bookshelf speakers that need expensive stands instead of just building the cabinets as floor stands?
One of the reasons why they don't just build everything as a tower comes down to cost, but it also dramatically changes the performance of a speaker. It really does. Unless the base of that, quote, tower really is just solid wrapped in wood, in which case it's an integrated stand. If it is in any way hollow and shares cavities inside the cabinet with, say, the mid-range and the tweeter that sits towards the top, it may be the size of a bookshelf with a built-in stand, but the performance is going to be dramatically different than if you had a, quote, bookshelf sitting on a stand. So that's one of the reasons why they don't do it. It's not the same speaker. Second is cost. Whether you want to pay for stands aftermarket or you would prefer the speaker designer build them in, you're going to end up spending about the same because material is material. And dimensional shipping is dimensional shipping. I get not wanting to have to pay for stands because sometimes they can get expensive, but you're going to pay for it regardless. Okay. Improved garage.
Let me just repeat that question for you.
Yeah.
It seems there is a growing expectation for manufacturers that bookshelves are not going to be used on actual bookshelves.
Yeah.
They're going to be on stands several feet out into the room. Did manufacturers change over time? Or are we just better informed about this requirement now?
Yeah, I don't think manufacturers changed over time. I'll be honest with you. Coming up in this hobby before I started doing it professionally, in the late 80s and 90s, they were called monitors. Like my first several speakers, while technically you could call them bookshelf speakers today, in the early 90s, they were called monitors, largely because they were probably modeled after monitor-like speakers in a control room or a recording studio. I think the bookshelf name or description came about as a marketing thing. And it just sort of stuck. Are enthusiasts more educated, more okay with the fact of putting small two-way stand mount bookshelf, monitor, whatever you want to call them, on stands brought out into the room? Maybe. But no sooner do I say that than I can go to Facebook or Google or Instagram and find any number of examples where people are going to set speakers up however they want. Let's just be real. You can sit here and have an entire section of your video dedicated to for best results. This is the placement I would recommend, and it's seconded by the manufacturer. But at the end of the day, people are just going to do what they want to do, And so I think it's just a name. I think it's just a description, a word, and that has very little bearing on how it's actually supposed to be set up.
We're going to go ahead and just head right into comparisons.
Okay.
While you did go over a lot of comparisons.
I know I missed one. I missed one big one.
Yeah. We're not going to get to that yet.
Okay.
At Raz Al Ghul. Sorry.
Oh, no, Ra's al Ghul, Batman character.
What's that?
Ra's al Ghul. It's a Batman villain.
Oh, is it?
It's a comic book Batman villain.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Played by Liam Neeson in Batman Begins.
Learn something new every day. Anyway, that person says these vintage box speaker designs versus tower speaker designs, what's the difference in usage for? What do they do better at versus each other?
I mean, as far as the Leak 250 is concerned, it's big enough, close enough that I don't see a giant performance delta between it and, say, a comparably priced three-way floor stander with similar driver complement. The Leak 250 probably could have easily been its own little tower deal, but at that point, it wouldn't be a continuation of the original Leak sandwich speakers. So I have a feeling the physical size of the speaker itself, the way it looks and all of that, is absolutely just a throwback to its heritage, not because it necessarily needed to be that way.
At Jason Bartlestone says, how would you compare, obviously, the Leak with the Mophie source point? And I'm assuming, look, we have not been able to hear the new Andrew Jones speakers that are towers. So all we can do is compare it to the Source Point 8 that we reviewed.
Yeah, a more or better comparison in this instance would probably be the Source Point 10, because that uses a 10-inch driver, which is very similar to the 10, 11-inch driver that's in terms of size, that's in the 250. Compared to the Source Point 8s, these are going to be the Source Point 8s were a little bit livelier, a little bit more dynamic, just right out of the gate, not as heavy, or not as weighty in the bass, albeit the 250s do need to be properly powered to unlock all of that. But on their own, the Source Point 8s, even with crazy good amplification, just are not going to play, in my experience, or at least in our room, not as deep as the 250s. The Source Point 8s were a little bit more picky to placement. I mean, that is a B&W level tunable speaker with toe-in. I know that toe-in's very important with the 250, but the Source Point 8s, How you set them up becomes even a bigger deal. It is very possible for the source point 8s to become, in my humble opinion, outright bright. Whereas I never really got that vibe from the 250s. They're both great though.
It's really difficult for me to pick between the two.
Yeah.
Because I loved the source point 8s.
Oh yeah.
They were great for me.
Yep.
In terms of intelligibility.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty close.
Yeah.
They're pretty close, but I think that the 8s may give you just a tiny bit more intelligibility.
Sure.
In terms of like if you're watching TV shows and movies.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you that the source point 8, while there is a vintage element to it, that front baffle is really modern and so unique. It's like something I've never seen before.
Yeah.
But if you like a true vintage look, the 250s, that's where it's at.
Yeah.
It's a great speaker.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked it. When I compare all of the, I guess now, IAG branded speakers between the original Wharfdale 85 that we reviewed, the Super Denton, the Linton, and then now the Leek 250.
And both missions.
Oh, I forgot about the missions.
Yeah, both missions.
I think I would go with the Leek 250.
Yeah, this one would be a toss-up for me between 250 and Mission 770.
Okay, now to the most common comparison question.
Yeah.
How dare you
How
not
dare I?
mention the KLH Model 5? At BigSight says the obvious, how does the Leek compare to the KLH Model 5?
Right. Full disclosure, I just forgot. How does it compare? To be honest with you, I'd rather have the 250. They're very similar. They're very, very similar. But the finish quality, the materials, and all of that, in my humble opinion, on the 250 are just better. It looks like a nicer speaker. Now, if that's not important to you, let's just focus on sound quality. The KLH Model 5 does require a bit of power. It is a sealed design, and so it does require a bit of power to extract all of the oomph and control that that speaker is capable of. Now, I know I've also gone on record in saying that, no, the 250 likes power as well. The difference being is that, like I said earlier in this video, the 250 can grow with your power needs where you may have to start at a slightly higher point with the KLH Model 5 to really appreciate and keep that woofer from being a little bit on the fat side, a little just kind of blurry. I also found the KLH Model 5, and my measurements in this room kind of bear this out. It has a bit of a mid-range bump. There's a bit of energy, so it's going to have a little bit more of a forward presence in direct comparison, potentially. It also may, for some people, depending on setup, it may come across as brighter than the 250, whereas the 250 is just a little bit more neutral on its own. That's about all I got.
Well, Mike wants to let you know, can we just have a default comparison of every speaker you review here on in with the Polk R700? For example, this is a great value speaker considering it has real wood veneer, metal trims, and it's imported and made in lower quantities.
Okay.
If you see it as a vintage-ified and upgraded finish Polk R700, I'd pay for that if they sound similar. They don't.
Yeah, they don't sound similar at all. The Polk is a great speaker. Largely, it's just been retired as it's a goat. It's a $2,000 goat. Let's just leave it at that, because as much as I would love to be able to, compare absolutely everything to everything else, sometimes we just got to mix it up a little bit. I mean, if even for my own sanity. The Polk is going to be a little bit broader all around. It's definitely going to be broader in the base. And if you can power the Polk properly, some of that broadness does gain some focus, but it's never going to quite have the focus that the 250 has. But it's also going to maybe play a little bit lower than the 250. Mid-range wise, about the same, maybe, give or take. The tweeter, though, the Polk rolls, just keeps rolling like that cheese wheel in the UK. Whenever those people just hurl themselves down a hill after a wheel of cheese, that's the Polk tweeter. It just goes, whereas the 250 is just, it's much more gradual. So that extension, that little bit of top end detail, air, presence, it remains. Whereas a lot of people have found that the Polks can be like, I wish there was just a little bit more.
Well, we're going to move on to another brand.
Okay.
That you should have covered. Well, I mean, I guess you technically covered them, but anyway, Victor 43377 says, I feel like the Forte 4 should have been a part of this comparison.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I could see that. I think the Forte 4, if memory serves, though, that's like $4,200 a pair of speaker, 45, whereas the Klipsch Heresy 4s, which we did compare it to, is right there at the same price as the 250. Well, I mean, there's no beating around the bush. The Forte 4 is going to be more sensitive, efficient, easier to drive. The dynamic envelope, therefore, is easier to unlock. Not to say that the Forte 4 or any Heritage speaker doesn't benefit from quality amplification. You can just get away with maybe having a quality 20 or 30 watts as opposed to maybe a quality 200 watts. Yeah, I guess, yeah, they're both very, very comparable. They're both what I would consider heirloom level products. They can grow with you. The Forte 4 is arguably the absolute best value overall in all of the Heritage loudspeakers. It's this much off Cornwall 4, but it is notably better than Heresy 4. And then once you get into La Scala and Klipschhorn, we're talking about entirely other animals.
I mean, I feel like the Forte 4, like the Klipsch, Heresy 4, will have a more of a livelier sound than the Leak.
It does. It does. The Forte 4, though, is not quite as in your face as the Heresy can be. It's still lively, but that broader Cornwall 4 mid-range horn that the Forte 4 has does kind of let things take just a little step back. So maybe it's not quite as, you know. But it is still going to be a little bit more, you are there in direct comparison to the 250.
Well, speaking of the Heresy 4s, at John Gutmanis says, I wonder, do the Heresy 4 lose anything when you put them on stands? We rearranged our living room and my 4s are blocked by furniture. The soundstage is ruined now. I don't want to, but stands, I think they mean buy stands, if it's not going to improve the sound.
It's going to change it for sure. It's going to change it for sure. And it's definitely going to impact the bass. They will still work, and they will even still sound pretty good. But the port being on the rear and close to the floor, firing directly into the floor as originally designed, is part of what gives them their boundary reinforcement on the low side, on the low end. And when you kind of pick that up off the ground and take away that angle, it does affect things. And it does make them a lot more bookshelf-like versus surprisingly tower-like. They'll still work. They will. But if your room loads bass and you have been super happy and felt like, oh my God, the Heresy 4s in my room don't require a subwoofer, because there's that 40 hertz, 30, 40, 50 hertz bass bump, that may go away if you raise them up off the ground, in which case maybe you're like, oh, wow, these are way more clear than I thought, way more pinpoint, way more accurate, but they seem lean. That could be the reason. And then, of course, you can augment it with a subwoofer, which maybe you have room for, maybe you don't.
I mean, I know that we've seen a lot of people talk about putting the Heresies on stands, and we both have been like, no.
We've tried it. I've done it a few times. I put them on the stands where I didn't mind them too much, and I didn't feel like they radically change the speaker's sound. When I put them on the JBL L100 Classic stands, it does get them up off the ground, or the KLH Model 5 stands. It does get the Heresy 4s off the ground, that 4 to 6 inches, while keeping their natural rake somewhat intact. That's the best stand combination that I can recommend. When I put the Heresy 4s on the Wharfdale Linton stands years ago, that I did not like. And then just for funsies, I put them on our solid steel stands, and that was awful.
We're going to end things with Vadim.
Oh.
One of our favorites.
Yeah.
With all of these new additions to the market that are all old school looking speakers, and some have old school sound as well, do you think this is a separate category that will become mainstream, since so many more speakers are design focused as well, not just sound? It's an interesting development for me, especially if you get more modern sound, which I lean towards, example, Bowers and Wilkins of today, Martin Logan.
I know I answered this question in the comments, but I've had more time to think about it. I don't think it's going to be its own new kind of market segment. I do definitely think that this is a trend. There's always going to be a market for timelessness. And I know I said this in my original response. There's always going to be a market for timeless. And so if a speaker is built well, sounds good, it will be timeless. Now that timelessness may be retro, may be vintage looking, but I think you're seeing a lot more vintage inspired, or however the other viewer said, vintagified speakers purely out of trend. And you're just seeing trendiness hit hi-fi with a sledgehammer right now. It's just a trend. It's just a cycle. I think the 250s definitely are designed to harken back to that bygone era, but they are modern sounding. They are purpose built, that it is possible that they will stand the test of time and they could be someone's forever speaker despite looking, quote, older.
I think nostalgia is always going to be on trend. I think with time, it all changes.
Yeah.
It's like when I was growing up, like vintage, like the 70s era clothes were like, that's what I wore. And you're seeing it now again. Yeah. Everything is cyclical.
Yeah.
So while I think we're seeing a lot of 50s and 60s era speakers resurface in the form of a brand new release, I would not be surprised if in the next 10 years you start seeing designs that were popular in maybe the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah, and it's already happening. And that's the thing, is it's already happening. Like Bang & Olufsen is kind of ahead of the trends, or on trend in a much more fashionable way. But they have started, albeit at a very premium price, they have actually started re-releasing their late 80s, early 90s speakers in limited quantities right now. And so long as that continues, I would not be surprised if, we go a little bit away from the boxy and we get into more of the metals that were quite popular, the metals and the plastics and whatnot that were quite popular in the 90s, on our way to whatever comes next.
Yep.
So.
All right.
That's it?
We'll see you later.
That's it, huh?
You're going to want to show up on Sunday. Sunday's
video to me is the video I've wanted to bring you all year. And I don't want to spoil it beyond that. I think you all know what it is.
You're not spoiling anything.
But I really hope you guys tune in Sunday, because I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it, and I think you're going to enjoy it too. But I want to thank you guys all for watching this episode of Unplugged. And again, if you missed our Leak 250 episode, now that we're at the end of this, you have permission to go ahead and thumbs up and like this video as you head on your way to watch the original 250 review, so that you can rewatch this Unplugged and have it all make sense. Haha. Anyway, that's it for us today. Thank you so much for watching. We always do enjoy bringing you these videos, and we'll see you Sunday. Until then, take care.
Bye.